Question: would you rather go to Boston while you're alive or post-mortem? Answer: go and make a booking and go to Boston now, see it, it's a beautiful place to be. Which is why, following Barry's example, brains no longer went to Boston because people like Michael Buckland did something about it, and we now do that study right here. Let's hear all about it.
Thanks, Adrian. And yes, I'm very pleased to be able to give a bit of an overview and an update of the Australian Sports Brain Bank activities today. And really, I'm going to start off with a very brief introduction on the neuropathology of CTE, so what we see under the microscope when we examine the brain. And I'm going to follow that up with what our experiences here in Australia have been so far and what we've learned, then also our plans for 2020 and beyond. As many of you might know, the first report of CTE was in 1928, and by then it was called punch-drunk syndrome, done by Dr. Harrison Martland from the USA, described a clinical syndrome of ex-boxers that had problems with slurring and incoordination and problems thinking and problems with their mood, and he called it punch-drunk. And when I was in medical school, at the end of our lecture on Alzheimer's disease, we were told about this very interesting but very rare thing called punch-drunk syndrome that occurred in some professional boxers. And really, probably for the first 10 or so years of my professional working life, I went through life thinking of that concept. Yeah, this is a funny thing, but it's only seen in boxers. I arrived here in RPA in 2009 and started to look at a lot of brains, and it was really only in 2013 that I found that, in fact, it wasn't in boxers just by exclusively. So we have Chris Nowinski here today, who's head of the Concussion Legacy Foundation, and when him and Anne McKee started their research back in 2005, they were only able to find 42 cases of punch-drunk, or now what we call chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. There are only 42 cases in the literature, and almost all of them were in boxing. That changed relatively quickly, and certainly in 2013, with the publication of this paper, I became aware of the fact that this had a very distinctive pathology and was found in a wide variety of sports people, not just boxers. I then started to think about, well, I see a lot of brains and I do a lot of tau stains. Have I ever seen that before? And I'm pretty sure I never did. I'm pretty sure I'd never seen it before because the pathology was quite distinctive, and I'm going to take you through that now. So, yeah, at this stage, CTE is a diagnosis made under the microscope. So it's moved from being a clinical diagnosis to one being made under the microscope after death. And that's because at this stage, that is the most reliable way to make the diagnosis. And it's a distinctive pattern of an abnormal protein called tau that gets deposited within the brain. So tau is a normal cellular protein, but in CTE, it gets abnormally folded and aggregated and deposited within certain parts of the brain. Now, it's not exclusive to CTE. Tau accumulates in many different neurodegenerative or dementing diseases. And certainly Alzheimer's disease, we see tau as a requisite part of the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, as well as some frontotemporal dementia such as corticobasal degeneration, progressive supranuclear palsy, and also some very interesting and very rare disorders such as post-encephalitic Parkinsonism. You may not think you've heard of that, but if you've seen the movie Awakenings, then you've been exposed to that syndrome. And that is very interestingly, if you haven't seen the movie Awakenings, that is a disease that affected people after they contracted the flu, in the flu epidemic at the turn of the 20th century. So this is actually another example of an environmentally induced, so you get a virus, after that you get this progressive neurodegenerative disorder. It's an environmentally induced neurodegenerative disease characterised by tau accumulation. Again, in a different pattern to CTE, but it's certainly, CTE is not the first environmentally induced neurodegenerative disease. Now, tau accumulates within neurons and some other cells in the brain called astrocytes in two forms. The first and most classic form are these things called neurofibrillary tangles. This is a standard H&E stain we see down the microscope, and if you squint your eyes, you might be able to see these purpley fibres accumulating within the cytoplasm or the cell body of this neuron. We're able to do different stains to highlight these neurofibrillary tangles, and the first stain that was developed, again probably close to 100 years ago, was something called the silver stain, and it's very similar to the old way of developing a black and white photograph. And by doing these chemical reactions, you deposit silver on the neurofibrillary tangles, and you can see here how the black highlights where the tangles are. And for the first time, we were able then to see that not only were the tangles in the cell bodies of the neurons, such as here, but it's also accumulating in their processes. So that the development of that stain certainly added to our knowledge, and that really fueled our understanding of Alzheimer's disease. More recently, we now use a monoclonal antibody directed against tau, which stains it brown. And it shows here we've got another neuron with this brown stain against tau, showing there's a neurofibrillary tangle in this neuron. You'll notice down here as well, there's another neuron that's brown as well. But it's not dark, and the brown is sort of granulary, and that, it's sort of dot-like, and that is abnormal tau accumulating that is yet to form those tangle structures that we typically expect to see on the H&E. So this is often called pre-tangle pathology, because it's abnormal tau, but it hasn't yet formed those insoluble tangles. The way we distinguish CTE from other diseases is, as I said, whereabouts it accumulates in the brain. So if you look at this model of the brain here, I'm sure it'll all look familiar to you. You're very aware that the outer surface of the brain has a sort of a bumpy surface, and there are ridges and valleys. The ridges are called gyri, valleys are called sulci, but there are ridges and valleys. Typically, CTE will start here in the frontal lobes, and often here right in the front of the temporal lobe as well. But it starts not everywhere, but right down in the depths of those valleys. And I'll show you a picture of that now. So this is what it looks like under the microscope. I've added in a dotted line to show you that we're just right at the depth of one of those valleys in the frontal lobe of the brain here. And you can see this abnormal accumulation of tau positivity, these brown stains. And it's not regularly distributed, it's irregular and patchy, the accumulation of tau. And if you squint your eyes again, you might be able to see this is a little blood vessel here. And it tends to accumulate at the depths of these valleys, the depths of the sulci, around blood vessels. And that is the characteristic lesion of CTE. So if you think of it and go looking for it, you're quite easily able to distinguish it from other diseases such as Alzheimer's disease. So we know as well that CTE starts in a different spot to Alzheimer's disease, the tau pathology, and it spreads in a different pattern to that of Alzheimer's disease. So these are, if you imagine a previous brain model and you've sliced it in half, and you're looking at the middle surface of the brain now. Down here we've got the different stages of CTE pathology versus Alzheimer's disease pathology here on the right. And you'll see, as I've said, that it often starts very early on in this frontal lobe regions, and as it progresses, it tends to move more to some of the temporal lobe until it hits this area down here, the medial temporal lobe or the hippocampus, which is one of the most key areas for your memory. So once it hits here and your memory goes, it tends to look a lot like Alzheimer's disease in these more severe stages of CTE. And you'll see the differences with Alzheimer's disease. It often starts very early on in that medial temporal lobe structures, before only in later stages it spreads to those frontal lobe structures. So it's like Alzheimer's disease goes this way, CTE goes that way. So not only have we got a different pattern under the microscope, just looking at the brain as a whole, we see there's different patterns of regional involvement and spread from one region to another. This is a tau stain on Alzheimer's disease, and rather than that irregular perivascular accumulation, we're seeing a more uniform accumulation of tau across the cortex. And I've just put the CTE picture next to it to show how different these two diseases look under the microscope. Got a few more cases here. This is a very low power shot of another brain we've got, which is very interesting. That's my hair, you can see there. I'm sorry about that. But it is good there as a scale bar. So this is sort of the magnification we're looking at. So for a microscope, this is low magnification. And here you can actually see the ridges and the valleys here. And you'll see it should be quite obvious that there's so much more tau down here at the depths of these valleys. There's another little valley here with some more down there. But in this case, which is a bit more severe, we're now starting to see the tau spread up here as well. It's not nearly as concentrated, but it's starting to spread up over the top of those ridges as well. That's certainly one very important way in how the tau spreads as the disease progresses. This is just another example of a slightly more severely affected brain, where again we've got this accentuation of the tau at the depths of the valley here, but now we're starting to see it is definitely spreading up some more up the sides here. But still, that's quite characteristic, that much darker tau at the depths of the sulci, or the depths of the valleys. This is an interesting case of severe CTE, where we've now got the tau spreading up the sides of the ridges and over the top of the ridge, and I've actually taken a photo from the top of that ridge, or the gyri, and you can see there's lots of tau here. This is the surface of the brain. This is where the white matter is, the nerve fibre bundles. So this is the cortex. And you can see that a lot of the tau is up here in these more superficial layers. There's just irregular clumps further down. And I'll just put this is the same region of the brain we've taken from another photo. But this person had Alzheimer's disease. And again, you can see now how different it does look. But often there's more neuronal tau in the deeper layers in Alzheimer's disease and less so up here. But certainly very much that superficial accentuation is gone in Alzheimer's disease. And this was from an AFL player who kindly, our first brain donor, sorry, not AFL, he was a Australian rules football player, played in the West Australia Football League. He was the first brain that was donated to us. And he didn't have CTE, he had Alzheimer's disease. So as I've said before, the clinical features of CTE are non-specific. So at this stage, they're not able to be confidently diagnosed during life. We do hope that will change in the coming years, but at this stage, it still needs examination of the brain after death. We do know that the advanced stages of CT often look like Alzheimer's disease to the treating doctor. So it's not uncommon, we suspect, that on the death certificate a doctor might write Alzheimer's disease when potentially it could be CTE, and you won't know if you don't look at that brain after death at autopsy. We do know that less advanced cases may predominantly present with depression or mood swings, explosivity, loss of attention and concentration, short-term memory loss and headache. So these earlier stages do look very different to Alzheimer's disease in general, and you can see that in some of those descriptions there, they can have a bit of a psychological or psychiatric flavour. You know, oh, you're just depressed, oh, you've just got, you know, there's a mental health issue. Then potentially there could actually be an organic disease going on in that person's brain. And as I've said, we will only know by examining the brain at autopsy. So that's why we're really very keen on progressing the Australian Sports Brain Bank. We're only at this stage, we're only going to get to the bottom of the problem by looking at more brains at autopsy. And I think, as I said before outside to the SBS crew that we're here, that I don't know how common this problem is. What worries me is that this is relatively what worries me is this is not an uncommon problem in selected populations, sporting populations, and other populations that undergo repetitive head injury. Is there a link between repetitive head injury and CTE? Well, what we do know, and probably the best data we have from epidemiology, is that there is quite a markedly higher incidence of Alzheimer's disease in ex-professional soccer players from the UK. There was a very large study of 7,000 players recently published by Willie Stewart from Scotland, and also in NFL players. So this is looking at people, what's written on their death certificate, not what's looking under the microscope, but what's written on their death certificate. We also know that risk of motor neuron disease and some other degenerative diseases, as what's written on their death certificate, is also significantly increased. These are highly statistically robust findings. Many thousands of players were surveyed and their death certificates reviewed. And as I've said, that's not autopsy studies. So what we need now to do is back that up with that autopsy diagnosis. And you'll be hearing more about the great advances that have been made in Boston from Chris Nowinski very soon. So we launched in March last year. We have over 200 pledges for brain donation now. I think at last count it was about 225. Probably, yes, thank you. which is terrific. Yeah. And I think between 15 and 20% of those are female, and certainly in moving forward in the future we'd like to see that ratio, obviously all the numbers to go up, but also that ratio of male to female pledges get more towards a 50-50 split. What is something that wasn't anticipated before we launched is that we're now getting regular contacts from people, either individuals themselves or their family members looking for help. We've had over 30 cases referred for clinical assessment and care, and I just understand Dr. Rowena Mobbs, is our neurology director, is here today, who kindly has seized all people that have in the Greater Sydney area that reach out to us. And I think you told me today it was more than 40 now. 45. So without making a big deal of it beforehand, we actually have an active clinical assessment and care program, an informal one that's been going ever since we launched. We've had 9 brains successfully retrieved, and that's we've able to retrieve them from Sydney, Newcastle, Melbourne, Perth, Brisbane and the Gold Coast. So again, we're not just a Sydney-based, we're definitely a national Australian network, and I'm very grateful for my neuropathology and other pathology colleagues from across Australia that drop everything and facilitate these brain donations out of their goodness of their heart, and they're wanting to help. They're not here today, they're obviously elsewhere, but I certainly wanted to go on record that this is a network and there are many people working hard behind the scenes across the country. Our clinical research arm is the final ethics revision has just gone in, Rowena, yesterday, I think. So we're very keen that that is launched next year, and we're very grateful for Rowena for driving that along. As many of you would know, in June we published 2 case reports of CTE in rugby league players. I should make it clear that these actually weren't brains donated to the Sports Brain Bank. They came through our normal, as a neuropathologist, I see lots of brains through a variety of clinical pathways. They came through those other clinical pathways. We get coronial referrals, we get hospital referrals, we get a wide variety of brains that are sent by a wide variety of means. That did generate a lot of interest, and this is just one example from the Sydney Morning Herald. And I also wanted to take the opportunity to say that I don't know how many of you would read ACTA Neuropathologica communications regularly. I suspect not many, and that's where we publish. It's a good journal. But that's where we published this article. So if it wasn't for people in the media, people in social networks talking about it. How do we get that message out? And we're grateful for, certainly so far, the responsible media reporting that we've seen in the Australian media. And Chris will be talking a bit more about responsible reporting, I think, in his talk. As you're probably also aware, soon afterwards, Dan and Hayley Folkes, the children of Steve Folkes, came out and said that their dad was one of those first cases. And again, incredibly grateful to both of them for, I mean, what a very brave thing to do. And Hayley's here today, and we'll speak a little bit on the panels afterwards. And I just want to take you through, very briefly, our first 3 donated brains that we've analysed. So the first case I've already talked about. This was an ex-player from the West Australia Football League who died in his 70s. And he died of dementia. So this was someone that was very demented. And when he died, his family reached out to us and said, would you be interested? And again, we're very grateful. He played 56 first-grade games. He had no evidence of CTE, but he did have severe Alzheimer's disease. So I think that's an important, and there was a very small article in the newspaper a while ago about that. And in that, I want to say something I said in that article, which is just because you played a lot of footy, and even if you're getting some cognitive issues, it doesn't mean you've got CTE. And this guy obviously played a lot of footy, he had dementia, but he ended up having Alzheimer's disease. A second case was an ex-professional boxer. He died in his 30s by suicide. He'd been boxing since childhood. He'd played at least 3 professional matches in the super middleweight division, I think that's what it's called. And he had a more severe traumatic brain injury as well as stage 1 CTE. And the third player was an ex-professional rugby league player who died in his 70s. He died of cardiac disease, and he played 6 years of professional first-grade rugby league. He had stage 2 CTE. I should say there are 4 stages of CTE, 1 to 4. So when I say stage 1, it's 1 out of 4. Stage 2 is stage 2 out of 4. It's just some pictures of the pathology in his brain. Again, seeing so much cleaner and neater than the other pictures I was showing you before. But again, we've got that depth of the valley there. Then down here, we've got around a vessel, and this is it in higher power, we've got tau, and all that tau staining. So these sort of lesions dotted about the frontal lobe made his case a stage 2 CTE. And again, we're very grateful to his wife, Margaret, who's the only picture I could find of her was here, with Peter Moscat, who was brave enough to say, look, this was my husband. Peter sounded like a terrific man. I thought probably would have liked him very much if I'd met him during life. He did seem like a remarkable man. And we know, speaking with his wife Margaret, we know he had lived a very full and active life. He complained of headaches and had sought medical care for headaches for quite some time, so they obviously were bothering him quite a bit. He had displayed a slight increase in his level of impatience and would occasionally go off topic mid-conversation, but that was it. So he remained an engaging personality until the end of his life. And I think, as I said, this was someone that was certainly very active and healthy. He looked after himself, watched what he ate, was socially and intellectually engaged, a wide social circle, and certainly very strong social justice ideals. So he was someone that, with all these things, and I think I want to talk about this a bit because Chris is going to talk some more about that. Are there things we can do, even if you might be someone that has had lots of knocks and getting a bit of cognitive issues, are there things you can do to maintain your brain health? And I think Peter would be a fantastic example of that. So just to finish up, what we're planning to do in the future. Well, as I said, we've got 9 brains, so there's several more brains in the pipeline we expect to come out over in 2020. Obviously, that's very dependent on the families wanting to talk about it. If they don't want to talk about it, then we won't talk about it. So we'll just wait and see how that unfolds. Obviously, clinical care is very important. We want to expand our activities here in New South Wales under the leadership of Rowena, as well as interstate. And as I said, we're very excited to hopefully soon launch our clinical research activities, both in Sydney and Melbourne. We have Dr. Alan Pearce here as well, who is our Melbourne Sports Brain Bank manager and an experienced academic researcher in concussion. And these are the sort of things we're going to want to do. Neuropsychology, we've got Jennifer Batchelor here as well, who's our lead neuropsychologist, advising us on how best to tackle this. Neurophysiology with Alan, blood-based biomarkers, brain imaging, and eye or retinal imaging and analysis as a potential diagnostic test. And we're doing that with Claire Fraser. And we're certainly very actively looking for new collaborations with Australian brain scientists and clinicians. So if you're one of those or know of one of those, by all means, we'd love to talk to you. So this is the team. So there's myself. I think this was taken about 10 years ago, so I'll keep using it for another 20 years, I think, before I update it. And as I've said, Rowena Mobbs is here, our clinical director. Rowena is a cognitive neurologist, and we're very grateful for her leadership in that area. Alan Pearce is our brain bank manager in Melbourne, and also a very established academic. We're very grateful for his input. Dr. Tony Harding is the brain banking scientist extraordinaire. He's the backbone of all our brain banking activities. We're very grateful for all of his activity. And we have other clinical colleagues as well. Jennifer Batchelor, as I've said, she's here today for neuropsychology. Dr. Claire Fraser for neuro-ophthalmology, and Dr. Adrian Cohen, who you've met already, who's very important in sports medicine and player liaisons area. So that's it. Thank you very much.